On a quiet stretch of rugged Montana countryside, nestled between amber hills and old-growth pine, stood the single-story log home I'd built with my own hands 15 years ago, a symbol of peace, retirement, and the life I had carved after 27 years on the force, now serving as the county police chief. My name's Wade Callahan, and all I wanted when I bought this 60-acre ranch was a simple life, to raise some horses, breathe clean air, and never again worry about sirens screaming through the night. But peace is never permanent when power-hungry people get a taste of control. And that lesson hit home the morning I returned from a 3-day sheriff's conference in Helena to find a quarter of my land flattened, fencing ripped apart, my livestock scattered in a hideous banner hanging from a chain-link temporary gate, future site of Cedar Ridge Estates Phase 2, a vision by President Marlene Driscoll. My jaw tightened, not just from the destruction but the sheer audacity of using my property still titled and registered to me, as if it belonged to some HOA nightmare fueled by ambition and Botox. The story started 6 months prior, when a slick-talking developer named Neil Landon came knocking, asking if I'd be interested in selling part of my land to expand the neighboring Cedar Ridge community. I declined, politely but firmly, explaining I had no interest in turning my pastures into concrete foundations and generic mansions, no matter how much they offered. He left with a smile, but something about it didn't sit right, the kind that says, "We'll see about that." Then came Marlene Driscoll, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, decked in designer sunglasses and wielding a clipboard like it was a sword. She introduced herself as the visionary leader of Cedar Ridge, explaining how expansion is inevitable and that community development would benefit everyone. I told her I'm not part of their HOA, and she had no legal grounds to force anything. She smirked, said we'll see, and drove off in a pearl-white Escalade with a vanity plate that read PEG Tres Estaciones. I figured that was the end of it, until trucks began parking along the southern fence line weeks later. Surveying equipment appeared on my land, and a backhoe was left idling behind my barn one morning. Each time I reported it to code enforcement, and each time they said they'd look into it, nothing changed. I warned them again, this is not some dispute between neighbors. This is trespassing, property damage, and a possible criminal conspiracy. But they dismissed it, probably swayed by the idea that I, the county police chief, would keep things civil and not escalate. They were wrong. Now, staring at the crushed remains of my horse stables and 3 bulldozers still parked like trophies, I knew this was war. I drove straight to county records, pulled every zoning map, deed, and planning application for Cedar Ridge, and sure enough I found something explosive. Forged documentation claiming I had consented to land transfer, signed and notarized, but the signature wasn't mine. I ran the notary's name through our system, turned out she was Marlene's niece, and under investigation in another county for document fraud. That was the match on gasoline. I gathered my evidence, opened an official investigation through the sheriff's department, recused myself for conflict of interest, and assigned Deputy Clara Jensen, sharp as a tack, incorruptible, and loyal to take the lead. Within 24 hours, she discovered payment trails from the HOA slush fund to contractors, inspectors, and even a zoning board clerk. I confronted Marlene at the HOA clubhouse, which looked more like a country club than a meeting place, and her expression when I flashed my badge was priceless. She tried to act confused, said I must be mistaken, that everything was already approved, and even accused me of interfering in municipal planning. I told her I wasn't here as a neighbor anymore, I was here as the law. The room fell silent. Still, she played her hand, lawyered up, and filed a counter-complaint claiming I was threatening her with my position. That was when I realized she was planning to spin the narrative and weaponize the media. And she did. By the next morning, local news ran a story with a smiling Marlene in front of a bulldozer, calling it a misunderstanding with a former police officer. I wasn't going to let that slide. I called a press conference myself, laid out the facts, played drone footage of the destruction, and showed side-by-side comparisons of my signature and the forged one. The public outcry began to rise. Former Cedar Ridge residents started contacting my office with horror stories of HOA corruption, sudden fines, property seizures, and secret votes. Marlene's empire wasn't built on community. It was built on coercion and fraud. That's when the threat started. An unmarked envelope on my windshield with a photo of my barn in flames, texts from burner numbers saying I better back off. But I'd faced worse from cartel leaders and murder suspects. A retired cop with nothing to lose is the wrong man to intimidate. I installed cameras, hired a security team, and most importantly, kept pushing. Clara obtained a subpoena for HOA financials, and what we found was shocking. Over $3.8 million in unaccounted fees, illegal land use permits, and off-the-books payouts to silence disgruntled residents. Then came the twist. Neil Landon, the developer, was actually under indictment in 2 other states for similar HOA-linked scams. He'd been using people like Marlene to illegally acquire land, destroy private property, and flip it into overpriced housing, all while laundering the profits. My ranch wasn't just targeted randomly, it was part of a pattern. With this new evidence, we secured warrants, raided the HOA offices, and arrested Neil on fraud and racketeering. Marlene, meanwhile, had fled, vanished without a trace, leaving her Escalade parked outside her gated mansion with her dogs still inside. But I knew she wasn't far. People like her don't run without a plan, and she had too many secrets to protect. I turned my full attention to tracking her down, knowing this story wasn't over. She'd bulldozed my land thinking I'd just file a complaint and move on, but she didn't realize I am the law in this county. And no one destroys what's mine without paying the price. What started as trespassing had become a full-blown criminal conspiracy, and I was just getting started. She wanted a war. I'd give her one, but this time, on my terms. The hunt for Marlene Driscoll wasn't just a matter of personal vengeance anymore. It had become a matter of restoring trust in the law and exposing a corrupt HOA empire that had spread its roots deeper than I imagined. Within days of the raid on the Cedar Ridge HOA offices, we had hard drives, binders, laptops, and bank statements, all pointing to a deeper operation involving multiple HOA boards across the state, and at the center of each, Marlene's fingerprints, either in email threads, shadow companies, or property deals traced back to her aliases. While the county DA worked on charging Neil Landon, I focused my attention on Marlene's escape route. Her phone had been deactivated, credit cards unused, and security footage showed her leaving town in a gray rental car heading west on Route 12. But her mistake was always assuming she was smarter than everyone else. I had Clara set up monitoring across nearby towns, airports, gas stations, and even vacation rental platforms. It wasn't long before her face popped up grainy footage at a gas station 2 towns over, wearing a baseball cap and wig, paying in cash, but unmistakably hurt. She was hiding, not running, which meant she had help. And that help turned out to be a name we didn't expect. Richard Brennan, the county assessor, someone we'd always thought of as harmless, if a little dim-witted, who had apparently been rubber-stamping Marlene's land adjustment approvals for years in exchange for cash and a luxury cabin in Big Fork. We picked him up after tracing a Venmo account used to pay a utility bill on the hideaway property. Under pressure, he cracked, admitting that Marlena was holed up at the cabin and had been planning to flee to British Columbia through a private airstrip owned by one of Neil's shell companies. We moved fast, a team of 4 deputies, and I drove up under the cover of night, snow crunching under tires, wind howling off the peaks. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen lake, lights off, chimney cold, but infrared scans from our drone showed one heat signature inside, pacing. I made the call to approach quietly, but when I knocked, the place exploded in chaos. A back door slammed, motion lights triggered, and a silver SUV roared to life from the garage. I sprinted across the icy driveway and threw down a spike strip. Tires screeched, the SUV fishtailed, and Clara blocked the road with her cruiser. Marlene stumbled out, screaming, "You have no idea what you're doing." But I did. I arrested her myself, read her rights, and for the first time, she didn't have a smug response. She looked terrified, and that's when I knew there was something else, something she feared more than the law. During questioning, she refused to speak, invoking her right to silence, but her files told the real story. Hidden in an encrypted drive was a list, dozens of names, HOA presidents, zoning board officials, real estate agents, all linked by coded payments and offshore accounts. This wasn't just a local scam, it was a statewide operation, maybe national. They'd been targeting retirees, disabled veterans, and landowners with property near expanding developments, using legal loopholes and forged signatures to seize land and flip it. My ranch was just the most high-profile grab yet. As word spread, other victims began to come forward, and we built a case wide enough to involve the state attorney general. Marlene was charged with criminal conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and forgery, but even behind bars, her influence lingered. HOA board members across the region began resigning, some disappearing entirely. One was found dead in his home in an apparent suicide, but I wasn't so sure. Something told me we were dealing with a network that didn't like loose ends. Clara and I worked tirelessly to map out the entire operation, but the deeper we dug, the more tangled it became. Properties were being bought and sold by LLCs that didn't exist 6 months ago. Contractors were ghost companies. Even some judges' names appeared in Marlene's email threads, raising questions about who had helped bury prior complaints. I needed to protect my own, especially after finding a GPS tracker under Clara's patrol vehicle. I increased security around my home, posted deputies near hers, and quietly opened a federal inquiry into the broader scope of HOA corruption because at this point, it wasn't about Marlene anymore. She was a face, not the architect. And that's when I met him, Thomas Varelli, a former federal real estate fraud investigator turned whistleblower, who had been trying to expose a multi-state HOA scheme for years but was silenced after a suspicious car accident left him wheelchair-bound. He reached out anonymously after seeing my press conference and agreed to meet. The man lived in a fortified house off-grid, guarded by cameras and a suspiciously well-trained German shepherd. He handed me a thumb drive and said, "Everything you've seen, it's the tip of the iceberg. Marlene's boss lives in Austin. His name's Brent Wallace. You go after him, you better be ready to burn it all down." The files he gave us revealed Brent Wallace had built a shadow organization, fake HOAs, fake communities, even fabricated homeowner complaints, all to justify legal action against unsuspecting property owners. His network included tech guys, lawyers, enforcement agents, and even ex-cops. I brought this to the DA, who escalated it to the feds. But the moment we issued a subpoena for Brent Wallace's holding company, the retaliation began. My ranch was set on fire in the middle of the night. I got the call from the fire marshal while lying in bed, heard the words "barn fully engulfed," and felt something inside me snap. I raced there to find everything gone, animals saved by chance, but the structure, the fencing, the memories, all charred. But they made one mistake. They left behind a gas canister with a fingerprint. It matched a man named Dominic Krall, former HOA enforcer turned freelance arsonist. We tracked him to a motel 2 counties over, and when we took him in, he sang like a bird. He'd been hired through an anonymous client with a Texas number, paid through a crypto wallet. All roads led to Wallace. The FBI took over jurisdiction, but I remained the lead liaison. I wasn't stepping away now. I'd lost too much. We traced Brent's location to an offshore condo in Belize, but before we could act, he flew back into Houston, likely to manage the fallout. The DOJ moved in, freezing his assets, and issued a federal indictment. It was the biggest takedown in state HOA history, over 40 arrests, $28 million in fraudulent property schemes, and the exposure of a criminal empire hidden in the plain sight of suburban America. But none of that soothed the sight of my scorched land. I stood in the ashes one morning, watching the sunrise, and felt the weight of the war settle. It had started with a bulldozer and a smug smile, but it ended in handcuffs and flames. Still, I wasn't finished. I had the badge, the authority, and the will to make sure no one ever went through what I did. I partnered with state legislators to draft the Property Owner Protection Act, designed to strip HOAs of unchecked power, require financial transparency, and criminally prosecute fraudulent land seizures. It passed unanimously, and Cedar Ridge was ordered dissolved, its lands returned to rightful owners. But for me, the fight wasn't about legislation. It was about justice for the veterans who lost their homes, the elderly couple who were fined into foreclosure, and every honest person who got bulldozed by corruption. I rebuilt my barn with help from neighbors who once feared the Hosroth, and for the first time in years, the community stood together, not behind a gilded gate, but around a fire pit, toasting freedom. Clara was promoted to lead investigator of a new task force aimed at HOA fraud statewide. As for Marlene, she struck a plea deal, 10 years minimum, plus full restitution. When she saw me again in court, she didn't say a word. She just looked down, finally stripped of her empire and her illusion of untouchable power. But I knew one thing: the storm hadn't ended yet, because the deeper rot was still out there, and I wasn't the retiring type anymore. I was back in the saddle, and this time, I was riding straight into the hornet's nest. After the arrests, the lawsuits, and the controlled burn of corruption that spread like wildfire across Cedar Ridge and the rest of the county, I thought the battle was over, but war, real war, never ends cleanly. The headlines called it a victory, the feds were patting each other on the back, and the public had its justice parade. But I saw what they didn't. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was preparation. Brent Wallace's empire had collapsed on paper, yes, but the deeper roots had simply gone underground, fracturing into smaller entities like splinters of a bone that refused to heal properly. I knew it the moment I received a letter from an anonymous sender, no return address. No fingerprints, just a folded printout of a deed transfer from a property over 400 miles away, in Nevada. At first glance, it looked irrelevant, but the signature caught my eye, an alias used by one of Brent's former shell companies. A rancher, much like me, had lost his land due to a sudden HOA boundary expansion despite never signing any such agreement. That was all I needed. I reached out, and sure enough, the man called Barrow had a near-identical story to mine. Bulldozers, forged permits, a shady HOA board that seemed more interested in forced buyouts than lawn regulations. It was happening again. Worse, the people behind it had learned from our tech. They'd gone darker, deeper, cutting off their digital trails and laundering money through fake maintenance firms, holding companies disguised as charities, and crypto wallets bouncing from Belize to Dubai. I couldn't let it slide, and I wouldn't. Clara and I formed a new unit under the state task force, working in coordination with the FBI's real estate fraud division. We weren't just chasing a few bad HOAs, now we were pulling at a web spun across 7 states. Through Cole, we uncovered 3 more victims. Through them, 10 more. This time, they weren't just targeting small ranchers, they were moving into distressed neighborhoods, places devastated by wildfires, floods, and economic decline, taking advantage of desperation and confusion to force lowball sales, only to flip the land under fake names and build gated communities before anyone could stop them. One such community, Whispering Pines in Utah, had been built atop 6 illegally seized plots, and the homeowners didn't even realize they were living on stolen land. We coordinated with the U.S. Marshals, and this time, we struck first. Dozens of raids went out in 1 week, and I personally led the takedown of an HOA president in Arizona, who had personally signed off on over $5 million in fraudulent land acquisitions. The rot was spreading, but so were we. The network had a new leader, now someone known only by a codename we kept hearing in encrypted email threads, Regent. We didn't know who they were, but they had access, funding, and connections, powerful enough to keep high-level people out of courtrooms. They were the ghost Brent Wallace feared. Our break came from a disgruntled former accountant named Samantha Cho, who had worked for one of the holding companies used by Regent. She was scared, terrified, really, and only agreed to meet under full protection. What she revealed was staggering. Regent wasn't one person. It was a consortium of ultra-wealthy developers, politicians, and ex-bankers who had banded together post-2008 to use HOA boards as their gateway drug into organized real estate fraud. Their motto, controlled the land, controlled the future. She gave us names, meeting logs, phone recordings. We had enough to bring the Department of Justice back into the mix, and they launched a nationwide sting operation called Silent Deed. But the more we exposed, the more dangerous it became. Clara was nearly killed in a staged hit-and-run. My home was broken into despite private security. A laptop containing key evidence was wiped clean even while air-gapped from the internet. Someone, somewhere, had access we didn't understand, so I went back to basics. I drove cross-country, face-to-face with victims, investigators, whistleblowers, judges, and even ex-conspirators who'd turned against the machine. What I built was not just a case, it was a movement. We called it Landline Justice, and by the time it gained traction, senators were getting behind us, investigative journalists were exposing HOA terror stories on primetime, and victims from every corner of the country were rising up. Marlene Driscoll, still behind bars, tried to cut a new deal by claiming she knew Regent's true face, but her credibility was shredded. Still, we took her confession and cross-referenced the details. One thing stood out: Regent had once held a summit in a private vineyard in Northern California. Clara and I flew in undercover and posed as investors. What we discovered blew the lid off everything. It wasn't a vineyard. It was a fortified estate, complete with underground meeting halls, panic rooms, and a surveillance network monitoring high-risk homeowners. This place wasn't just a retreat, it was a command center, and the man hosting it, Charles Granger, a billionaire philanthropist, media darling, a known advocate for housing innovation. He owned charities, think tanks, land banks, and yes, a dozen HOAs through shadow proxies. Charles Granger was Regent. Taking him down wouldn't be like cuffing Marlene or chasing down arsonists. He had lawyers stacked to the sky, PR teams, spinning narratives before we even moved. But he made one mistake. He trusted a man named Levi Harper, an internal security consultant who'd lost a brother to HOA corruption. I met Levi in secret. He gave us everything: meeting logs, surveillance, footage, confidential strategy files, where Granger laid out his plan to expand into 15 new states within 2 years. The DOJ greenlit a full takedown. Over 60 properties were seized. Granger was indicted on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, and targeted harassment, but the media war raged. Some called him a misunderstood genius, others a criminal mastermind. I didn't care. I saw him for what he was, the man who tried to steal America's land by burying it under red tape and asphalt. The day of his sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse while cameras rolled. I didn't give a speech. I didn't wear a uniform. I just looked him in the eye as he walked past, flanked by marshals, and said, "You picked the wrong land too." Bulldozed. That night, back at the ranches, I rebuilt it again. Stronger than ever, I stood beside Clara, looking out at the hills that had once been flattened by greed. Now they stood tall, fenced with reclaimed cedar, pastures full of healthy horses, and a new sign that read, "Owned, protected, never again." We passed legislation requiring all HOAs to register with federal oversight, all board meetings to be recorded, and every land transfer to be independently reviewed. A national hotline was launched for victims, and guess who took the first call that night? I did, a trembling woman from Georgia whose HOA had locked her out of her own home for planting native flowers. I told her, "We're here now. They don't get to do this anymore." So what did I learn? That justice takes time, that sometimes the badge is only as strong as the boots willing to wear it through fire, and that people like Marlene and Granger don't fear courts or cops, they fear exposure. And exposure, my friend, is what we gave them. So if you're out there, reading this, and you think you're alone, remember, there are people like me still watching, still fighting, and still willing to burn down every corrupt gate, boardroom, and bulldozer that dares to think it can steal what we've earned. This isn't just about land, it's about freedom, and I'll fight for it until the day I can't stand. Because I'm not just some retired cop anymore. I'm the line they don't cross. And if they do well, they better have more than an excavator. They better bring a damn army.